Hildy is a bawdy, chain-smoking, 70-something former journalist who lives on the Upper West Side in an apartment that has a portal back to 1973. Time travel has rules, though, and Hildy breaks them by traveling back with healthcare aide Trista. Now both women will have to come to terms with their pasts before they lose their chance at having a future. From Ahoy Comics comes Alisa Whitney's Guilt. That's Gilt, a comic book that's Sex and the City meets the Golden Girls by way of the Twilight Zone. Call your local comic book store and ask them to order your copy of Guilt today.
Welcome to Endless, a Sandman podcast from Chipperish Media. I'm writer, erstwhile DC Comics editor, and take-me-as-you-find-me deity, Alisa Whitney.
And I'm story expert and heaven's regent in the underworld, Lani Diane Rich. Today on Endless, we're going to be talking about Season of Mists, Chapter 6, Issue 27 from the Sandman comic book series.
Season of Mists, Chapter 6 was written by Neil Gaiman, penciled by Kelly Jones, inked by Dick Giordano, colored by Daniel Vazzo, and lettered by Todd Klein. This issue was edited by Karen Berger, assisted by me, Alisa Whitney. Cover by Dave McKean.
The war between heaven and hell is over. Time to wake up. In Season of Mist, Chapter 6, it is the morning after the banquet, and Cluracan has decided that they're not going to get hell shut down, so he spent his evening enjoying the company of a young man from the Egyptian delegation. Nula, meanwhile, wanders around half-naked, chewing flowers and listening to other people's conversations. Bast and Anubis, a wizard and his faceless companion. Loki, Odin, and a hungover Thor. Everyone wants hell, but no one is too confident that they'll get it. Dream bumps into the angels Remiel and Duma, who say they have a message from God, which Remiel translates as the message comes in, only to discover, horrified, that God has determined that Dream should give the key to hell to Remiel and Duma, who will be banished from the Silver City forever, so they can run hell. Remiel is very upset. Duma silently lowers down until his feet touch the ground for the first time. Dream sees God's point and hands the key over to the angels, and the war between heaven and hell ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Dream goes out to tell everyone his decision, and no one's really happy about it, but Azazel is pissed. He promises to consume Nada slowly, but Dream says that in the dreaming, all visitors are under the protection of his hospitality, including the ones he didn't know about. He jumps into Azazel's, I don't know, I guess you call it a face, and rescues Nada and Karanzan. When Azazel rejects Dream's hospitality and promises to destroy them all anyway, Dream uses his dream powers in the dreaming to stuff Azazel into a glass ball that looks a lot like a Christmas tree ornament and sets the demon aside to think about what he's done. Dream says goodbye to his guests and then tells Matthew to ask Nada to join Dream for dinner that night. They have much to discuss. All right, so Alisa, here we are, Season of Mist, Chapter 6, Sandman number 27, in which the vexing question of the sovereignty of hell is finally settled to the satisfaction of some, the finer points of hospitality, and in which it is demonstrated that while some may fall, others are pushed. So what did you think of this issue?
This issue, for me, reminds me of the play Pippin. So in 1974, my mom took me to see Pippin, and it's like the theater goes dark, and then you get these hands coming out of the darkness. They're just these disembodied hands. Mm-hmm. And then you get these beautiful, slightly dangerous Fosse dancers, and they're singing, "We've got magic to do just for you. We've got parts to perform, kings and queens and things." And anyway, that is what this is. This is the Fosse, glorious, intrigue-filled, sexy Fosse production of Sandman. Mm-hmm. And I just love it.
I love that interpretation. I have to say that, like, my daughter's high school put on Pippin for the spring musical, and it is the longest 3 hours of my life. I think part of me is still in that auditorium waiting for it to end. That said, I definitely see what you're saying. There's, there is kind of that vibe.
I'm so sorry that high school ruined it for you. I saw it with Ben Vereen.
You saw, yeah, exactly. That's a whole different experience. But this is something that I think a high school in 2018 may not have the cultural context to be able to really pull that off. But God bless them for trying. It's not always about doing good work. It's about doing the work. If you do the thing, you get the points. You're there.
I don't know. Wait, I just want to say, I think that's Satan's work.
It may well be. I have to say, I loved this issue. The stuff with Remiel and Duma was amazing and heartbreaking and beautiful and such a lovely little twist. Dream using the rules of hospitality to save Nada and Coranzan and make Azazel into a Christmas tree ornament, which, by the way, now I want that Christmas tree ornament, so I'm going to have to make it because I don't think it's available anywhere, but I really, really want it. It's just delightful. It's just, I love this issue. But let's go ahead and get started where we always start, with Dave McKean's amazing cover art. We have a blurred image of an angel in bright white light surrounded by grungy black darkness. It is such a beautiful cover, and I don't think I can really explain. Like, you have to see what this is to just get a sense of how incredibly beautiful it is. And I want it in a poster framed on my wall. Hopefully that's for sale somewhere.
Well, I think we need to do the craft session with the Coranzan. In my head, it's always been Choranzan, but I don't know. And I can't remember. I should have listened to the Audible version, but I don't know. Maybe
I did listen to the Audible version.
Maybe it's
but I was
Hebrew.
Focused on Azazel because I always got that one wrong.
Maybe it's like Choranzan. Like
maybe
Hanukkah.
It is. I have no idea, but I think that it's the Coranzan in your heart. I don't know why I say Coranzan instead of CH. I have no idea. Anyway, I think because I think of him as chronological. I think of it like that, kind of like that Greek.
I like that
etymology, maybe.
Well,
I don't know.
As for the cover, since we keep going, we haven't done this in a little while, so I think we keep going into weird tangents.
I moved cross country. We were gone. I was gone for 2 weeks. It's been insane. Now I'm here in Colorado. It's very exciting. But yeah, I'm not going to lie to you guys. I'm a little bit off my game.
Well, I don't know if that will make the final cut, but I have to repeat. Anyone who's listening, try and say Season of Mists, Chapter 6. It is not easy. So anyway, to the Dave McKean cover, I was thinking that the cover reminds me of an X-ray or even a negative of the image of an angel. And there's this part that's scratched and blurred and no longer perfect. And that seems so apropos for this issue.
Oh, God, it absolutely is. All right. So tell me some of your thoughts. You got a lot of stuff here in the notes. I am really excited to hear your thoughts on this issue, which, again, I'm at one of these places where I'm like, well, this is my favorite one so far. I say that almost every week.
Fussy. So I also, I love this issue. One of the things that I am noticing coming back to it is things half heard and things unspoken. As we start with following Nuala through the Dream King's palace, and we catch these snippets of half-heard conversation and then these pointed silences as the people, like the faceless guy, whoever he is, and the wizard guy observe Nuala and realize that she's within earshot. And it's just such great grounded storytelling. And it's also an interesting choice to me because back in the Dead Boys story, it was such a personal story, that story. But there were moments when we could see things that the boys themselves were not privy to, like the ghosts coming in from the outside. And I realize I'm talking with my hands. I've just sort of clapped my hands. I'm also out of practice. I'm going to put my hands in my lap. So here, this is this grand story of politics and intrigue. And we're looking from the eyes of this minor pawn. That's what she is. She's just she's a gift. And her brother gets to at least go and have fun, naughty sex. And she's just been asleep and eating flowers.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting choice. I think the technique of having the lettering deliberately illegible in places. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was done before. I know Josh Unruh. I'm always
Yeah,
bad. He's the Chorinson of my friends. I never
right.
But anyway, I'm sure it's been used somewhere before in comics, and he knows where. I guess everything's been done, but I can't remember this technique being used much before or after. People are probably going to prove me wrong. But I think a nice point for me here is how Neil trusts the silences and letting the art carry the story. And, you know, I've often given workshops where I'm trying to teach prose writers how to write for comics. And the initial urge is, how can I cram as many words as possible into this panel? And it's, you know, I always liken it, I'm sure I've said this before, like to being the guy in a ballroom dancing couple, where you have to have this amazing level of ability as the writer, but everyone's going to be looking at the artist, who is the Ginger Rogers of the duo.
I like that. Yeah. And I think it's one of those things that I think is difficult for writers in any genre, that we really want to write the hell out of everything and just like, you know, control for every detail. But if you know that your Ginger Rogers is going to be there to like take your movement and turn it into something backwards and in high heels, you know, and you can actually do that collaboration. I think that is something that is required of writers who are working in visual media, like, you know, comic books and television and movies. You have to release control to a certain amount and trust the artists that you're working with for them to like get your vision and be able to expand upon it and add those little nuances. I mean, I loved that about how some of the words were, you know, you could see little bits of them and maybe forget, which, you know, if you've ever eavesdropped and there's some stuff that you can't hear, you know, not that I'm a big eavesdropper, but, you know, there's some things that you can't make out or whatever. That is a really nice visual representation of that experience. And I thought that was really a very cool, especially because like in where she's listening to the Egyptian, you know, gods, Anubis and Bast. And so the letters are formed in this very kind of like Egyptian looking, you know, typography, letter work. And it's so beautiful how even the stuff that we can't read still gives that hint of that aesthetic, which is just an added extra layer of, you know, very, very cool, visually cool in this space.
Absolutely. And Todd Klein, you know, I think is such a brilliant letterer, makes you aware of what can be done with lettering, that font is not just a throwaway thing.
It's so powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's so thinking about words, I had these were sort of related points to me, because I realized with this, Neil talks in the script about the pacing and the issues with pacing. He keeps saying like, oh God, I thought I was going to be here by now, but I'm only here. And then, you know, you've got this huge, wonderful double page spread, which is when we get into the throne room, I guess, and it's this gorgeous architectural, you know, ceiling. It feels like you're in some vast palace and you've got all the gods assembled. Well, you know, I think there may be no captions, or it's just the credits in there. And I was realizing that pacing to me might be the greatest challenge in comic book writing. I was talking about this with Morissette, with Alan, my collaborator on Guilt. And, you know, I was talking about the fact that you know, pacing wise, when you have a lot of panels, it feels like time is passing more rapidly. It quickens the pace. And if you have panels that are more or less the same size, you get that feeling of one beat following another. Whereas when you get a big splash page or you have a double page spread, it's this, you have this moment with air and space and grandeur, and you've slowed the time down. But, you know, it is a sad, ironic thing that, you know, so you want to have more talkiness in smaller panels and space in the larger panels. And I know as an assistant editor whose job it was to letter these things, that you were often thinking, if only I could take this word balloon and put it onto that page where there were almost no words, but and a lot of space. but that would impact the pacing. So it's
Yeah.
I mean, every kind of writing, whether it's a novel or a play or a TV script, I guess everything has its own particular challenge. I think
Mhm.
I'm thinking right now that maybe pacing is the comic book writer's greatest challenge.
It definitely pacing, I think, is a really big challenge for any kind of extended like your flash fiction, your short stories. I think you can probably get the pacing down there. But the bigger story is, the more you're accomplishing within the frame of that story, like the more you have to think about pacing. And when you're thinking about in terms of comic books or like TV shows, right? Movies and books, if you go a little long or whatever, like especially books, like they'll let you go, 20,000 more words is no big deal for the most part, but that's a lot of story in 20,000 words. Whereas, a minute or more in a movie or in a TV show is absolutely, especially in the days where we had very strict, time, and it had to be exactly 22 minutes and all this stuff, that could be a problem. In comic books, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like you had a certain number of pages and that was generally it. Were you able to go over it all, or was what kind of a consideration was that?
I don't think with DC, I don't think it was a very rare thing where we got, a double pay. It was usually a planned thing if we knew something was going to be bigger, not like Ahoy Comics, where a couple of times I've gone to Tom Pyre, my editor, and said, could I just have one more page? And Alan has been really good. He's like, if there's a budget problem, like they don't even need to pay me. But of course, it always.
Oh, how sweet.
No, he's incredible. But the issue with this is that, of course, there are publishing costs every time you do an extra page, and it's complicated. But they've been kind. There are also fewer pages now. 24 pages was standard, and then it became 22. And 20 is often the standard now. So if you think when you're reading comics today that there seem to be fewer pages of story, you're right. There are.
Wow. Yeah. Sometimes that stuff tightens up. All right. So can you tell everybody again what Guilt is?
Oh, so Guilt is the comic I've just written. Guilt, GILT, stands for the Guild of Independent Lady Temporalists. And it's a time travel story about two sexy women, one in her 70s, one in her 40s, who time travel back to their younger days in the 70s, the 1970s.
I love it. So how do people get a hold of that? When is it available and how do they get it?
It's available April 6th. And if you have a local comic book store and you ask them, please, I must have my Ahoy Comics Guilt, then they will procure it for you forthwith.
Awesome. All right. Call your local comic book store and get a hold of that. And I actually believe that I have a link to independent comic book store like directory in the show notes. It should be in the show notes. I've added it in this automated feature that I hope will be working. And if it's not, let me know and I'll look it up for you. But definitely get a hold of your local comic book store and ask for Guilt by Alisa Whitney. All right. So, as you're talking about pacing, I'm thinking about where in the story we have this incredible twist. And the thing is that the twist as it happens, which is, Dream is still trying to figure out who he's going to give hell to. Remiel, who has no interest in any of this, he's just there as an observer, is like, yeah, well, God has a message for you. And he sits and he's like a telegram, just taking the message down, right? And so he is understanding what is happening as he's delivering the message to Dream, which, by the way, would be something that I think I cannot wait to see how this shows up in the TV show. But in a comic book, to get all of that across, to get those facial expressions as he is not just delivering the message, but realizing what is in the message, and objecting to it while at the same time, doing his duty and all of this. It's so incredibly beautiful. And one of the things, like, people who, have taken my classes and, have listened to me talk about writing will often hear me bemoan the twist, right? Because I think that, and I directly blame M. Night Shyamalan for this, because The Sixth Sense had a really great twist that was really well executed. And the thing is that it takes a lot of skill to do a really well executed twist. But a lot of writers were like, oh, now I must have a twist in everything. And so they're always looking to put in the surprise. And what happens with a lot of writers is that in order to hold up a twist, which, you did not see this coming, often what happens is that they end up putting up like a whole bunch of scaffolding, what I call scaffolding, which are things in the story that exist solely to hold up the twist, right? They're just holding that up so that you can do that work and everything. And they don't do anything else narratively, So depending on how much of your narrative real estate you are spending on scaffolding, that can get more and more onerous as you tell the story. And a lot of times I will see all of this scaffolding there, wasting my time for a twist that is not that interesting and not that, not that narratively constructed. It's simply there to be a twist. The narrative doesn't necessarily need it. In this instance here, we have and the fairly early parts of this story, we have this beautiful twist moment where Remiel and Duma are, delivering the message. They realize what's going on. Duma, of course, is completely silent. And all we see, and I'll talk about this when I come to my favorite panel, is him slowly lowering down. The feet have never touched base clay, right? Slowly lowering down until his feet touch the ground, while Remiel is really suffering with this decision that hell needs to go to them. The demons need to go back. The damned need to go back, and everything needs to be as it was, because hell is a reflection of heaven, and heaven doesn't have any meaning if hell does not exist. This whole thing. And then what I love too is that Dream is sitting there listening, watching this whole thing. And then he's like, yeah, can't argue with that. Here's the key, It's such a beautiful moment. And I really love, and the thing is the difference between the scaffolding, and an actual, organic twist that's built into the narrative is that we've had Remiel and Duma here the whole time, just observing, right? So we have always seen them there. It's not like they all of a sudden drop down in the middle of it and say, hell is ours, and snatch the key and change the whole direction of the narrative. And didn't see that coming, did you? What's beautiful is that if you can have the twist there in full view of everybody, but you're doing a narrative sleight of hand, so that we're so concerned with the fact that Azazel has Nada, and how is Dream going to make this decision? And yes, these angels are here, but so is a million other people. And, the angels are the only one, without a dog in the fight, that are just there to take a look. All of that is so beautifully set up, and then to turn it around and have it be the only right decision to be made, where there's been all of this. It's just so beautifully constructed. And so this is one of those instances where I'm like, I don't have a thing against twists. I have a thing against the compulsory twist that people feel they need to put in their stories, which they do not. And then all the scaffolding that you put up to try to maintain it when the story itself is suffering for that scaffolding. Here, we don't have any scaffolding. It's just beautifully constructed. And there is this moment of breath, and it is early in the story. Usually you see these big moments coming toward the end, This is, it's an odd construction. It's an odd structure, but it absolutely really works, because here we've had all of this buildup, all of these people fighting for this one thing. And then we all of a sudden have all of the wind taken out of every single sail, including the ones who get hell and don't want it, and then we have to kind of have that whole breath release, because we need to know what the hell is going to happen to Nada. We're in this now. The goal that has been Dreams from the beginning of this story was to get Nada out of hell, and was to rescue her. And so then he's able to go and deal with Corazon and dive into Corazon's little tooth eye face thing, void. I don't really know exactly what to call. I'm sorry, Azazel. Did I say Corazon? I meant Azazel. So he dives into Azazel, saves Corazon and Nada, pulls them out. does this whole hospitality thing. Reality is as he wishes it in the dreaming. Like, it's all of this stuff. And so we end up like the story in the beginning was the goal was for him to save Nada. Now he's finally able to do that. So that is the appropriate point. That is where the climax belongs. And the twist is not part of the climax. It's such an odd, unusual construction, but I think it works beautifully.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And it's funny, as you were talking, I was realizing it's a Deus Ex Machina. That doesn't feel like a Deus Ex Machina.
Well, see, here's the thing. Like, all of the, standard tropes that we kind of make fun of, a trope in and of itself is not a bad thing. A trope is a trope for a reason. The same way a cliche is a cliche for a reason. Like, those are things that we come back to. It's just that if you can use it in a way that has like real narrative juice in it, that like makes sense for the narrative and feeds what the story means and what it's about, because a story is a meaning delivery system. That's essentially what it is. We're there for the meaning. All sorts of fun, flashy hand waving and jazz hands can happen, and that's great. But we're there for the meaning. So if everything that you do with your various tropes that you apply are feeding that meaning, you're in good shape. You can do it. And I think that the literal Deus Ex Machina here is actually like warranted and works and is part of the meaning of the story. It contributes to the deep meaning involved in this fight for hell. So I say fair play.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting because we're talking a bit about the writing techniques, and I was thinking about the objects in the trunk. So there's that great moment where Morpheus, has captured Azazel, that Azazel being the darkness with the teeth. And
Yes.
And he's got it in the globe and he puts it in a trunk. And there are some other objects in the trunk. I have to look at the art again. In the script, it is specified. We've got a small, squarish, leather-bound box, locked. There's a ring, a coin, and an old-fashioned pocket watch as well. And I cannot remember if we got those stories later in Sandman or not. But the decision to show these objects was obviously deliberate, as were the unheard or half-heard conversation. And what it does is it gives us this impression of a vast universe of stories that we've glimpsed a little portion of, but we don't have the whole of it. And so I had this memory that came back to me. I was remembering saying something about loving this technique in the Sandman. And Paul Levitz, who was then vice president of DC Comics, but also an editor and a writer, himself said, "Oh yeah, that's the Zelazny technique." Now, I know of the science fiction writer Roger Zelazny, but I wasn't aware of a thing called the Zelazny technique. And so Paul Levitz explained it to me. And in order to sort of bring it to everybody, I thought I'd do a little digging, and I found this on some Reddit thing. If this is accurate or not, I don't know, but I think this is a bit of a Zelazny interview. And if I'm wrong, great hive mind, tell me. So Zelazny said that Hemingway had a theory that you could omit anything, and if the omitted part strengthened the story, then it actually made people feel like the story was more than the sum of its parts, something more than they understood. So Zelazny took this and kind of made it his own. And he decided that if it added something to the story as a whole, he would take a stock character and add a few extra sentences that showed that this character had an existence beyond his or her or their walk-on role. It's kind of like what they tell an actor to do. So even if you're just walking on stage, you're supposed to have in your mind where your character has just come from and where they're going to. It's not just you're wandering off the stage. So the Zelazny corollary of the Hemingway principle is an indication of the presence of things that aren't essential to the story, but give you a sense of a character's backstory. So he talks about, let's see, he'll often write all this stuff out to figure out what a character's past is. And then he'll allude to it, but he won't really explore it on the page, and he won't give the whole story. It's what Joss Whedon did when he mentioned in the Avengers, Budapest.
Right.
And then, of course, that was all squandered. But you remember how excited we all were. We're like, oh my God, what happened in Budapest?
Right.
So I'm just trying to see if there was anything else in this quote that I should say. That, it's the idea that you want people to feel something more than they understand about the story, and giving these little tidbits of parts of the story that you haven't all explored. So these objects in the trunk, to bring it back around, are part of Morpheus's backstory. He had a past before the Sandman comic began. He's endless after all. And here's tactile proof that there was a past. And these are stories that we don't know. We know about the Corinthian. We don't know about all these other objects. Maybe we will, and maybe we won't. And I think it's just, again, there are techniques and things here which I think writers can absolutely come away with and use. I don't know if Neil was aware of this as a Zelazny technique. He was a wide reader. He may have gotten it from some other place. But it's, anyway, so I'm just calling attention to that because it's cool.
Well, I really I wasn't aware of it as a Zelazny technique, but I've thought about that, and have employed it some in my own writing, and have seen it in a lot of places. But what I really like about it is that it really does kind of seed a world, that there's something beyond the four walls. I remember when I was doing the Outlander, I was doing podcasts about Outlander, Sex and Whiskey, and I would talk about how whenever Diana Gabaldon wrote, you felt like the four walls were there, like you could lean against it. You felt like the whole world was out there and put together because of the way that she wrote. And there was so much, that you felt like she knew everything in that world, even though not all of it was actually on the page. You felt very confident that if she said a wall was somewhere, it was always going to be in that place, And I think that there is something about knowing your world so well that you feel confident enough to drop a detail without feeling the need to tell that whole story. And maybe it'll come up later and you can pull that thread in and weave it into the story if you decide you want to, or you can just leave it there, but it is one of those things. It is a technique that I think is really valuable in filling out the world beyond the edges of just the space that you're telling your story in, that there's more stuff going on. And I love the fact that Neil was so specific about these items. Like, he knew what those were, whether or not they ever showed up. And that's kind of the value of writing, doing what I call discovery writing, which is where you, as an author, you sit down and you just write stuff that's never going to be in the story, or that you have no intention of being in the story, but it fills the world out for you. You should know more about your world than you're actually putting on the page. I used to compare it to an iceberg where 10% is up top and 90% is below. And you need to know that 90% as a writer, but the reader only needs that top 10%,
Absolutely. And I was just thinking that maybe the opposite of that kind of writing is when characters are constantly thinking and reflecting back on something traumatic that happened in their past that finally gets fully revealed. So it's like, don't let's talk about, I don't know, what happened in Cincinnati. That was terrible. Yeah. Cincinnati when I was 7, Cincinnati. And then finally you get like the terrible story of how they lost their Velveteen Rabbit. And that was traumatic. Right. And, and you feel like, okay, now I know what makes you tick. It was the loss of your stuffed rabbit. It can feel a little reductive.
Yeah, definitely it can. But I think that also there's some amount of leaning in that happens, which is something that as a writer you really want to do with your readers, is drop a little something and they lean into it. One of the things when I was teaching television production is I would show the opening scene to The Social Network that David Fincher had, as written by Aaron Sorkin. David Fincher directed it. In the opening scene, we have this scene where Mark Zuckerberg is talking with a woman that he's dating, and as they're having the conversation, they're in a bar and you can barely hear them. Like you can just barely hear the amazing Sorkin dialogue. Like, and the thing is that Fincher is holding the Sorkin dialogue behind this veil of noise, of ambient sound, right, of the bar. And as a viewer, you need to lean in. Like nobody's eating their popcorn at that time. Nobody's having a conversation with the person next to them. They're leaning in to hear it, and you become, as a viewer, it's a technique that makes you more involved. Like when we can't see something, we're filling it out in our own brain, and there's just more, engagement on the part of the reader. And again, watching anything, I always call it reading, because if you're engaging critically with a piece of narrative, you are reading it regardless of whether it's TV, movie, or book or whatever. So I think that it's like one of those techniques that allows you to get the reader to lean in a little bit, because they're like, ooh, what is that? There's the skull of the Corinthian. That was really neat, but what's the coin about? This is all significant, and when you're trying to look at, the page of a comic book, and again, that's part of what that art that you were talking about earlier, that's the leaning in. Like, we're leaning into those visuals and reading those visuals as well as we are the text itself. And so I think that Neil is showing like a really very elegant understanding of how that works here.
And I do remember him saying to me explicitly back, in those days, that the more intelligent you assume the reader is at connecting the dots, the more intelligent the reader will assume you, the writer, are.
I think, yeah, absolutely. There's that. And also that, like, your reader is smarter than you think. Like the average, like you look at the average person, we always have this idea of the like lowest common denominator as far as like, who we write our media for and that kind of thing. And I think that generally your audience is at least, I know that my audience is at least as smart as I am, if not smarter. And so I got to keep up with them. And I think when you know how smart your audience is and you play to how smart they are, that becomes a delightful back and forth with you and your audience. And people who think their audience is stupid are not going to be, I think, as engaging to read, So, I mean, knowing that your audience is smart, I think is the first, like, honestly, probably one of the most valuable steps into being a really excellent writer. But I have to say, like, going back to Azazel, I have to just shine a light on this one moment where we have a demon who is brought down by the rules of hospitality. And I just want to spend a moment with that because, oh my God, I could not love anything more than politeness and propriety being something that brings down a demon. That is beautiful, and Azazel's ripping time and space, all teeth and eyes design is so beautiful and creepy and TARDIS-y. It's bigger on the inside, I love it so much. And I don't know how I can ever make that Christmas ornament because I'm not artsy. I'm mildly craftsy, but I'm not artsy. But I just want to make an Azazel Christmas ornament and have that forever because I absolutely love that he puts him inside this. And I mean, let's not forget, like Dream, when he was captured, was in something that had that Christmas ornament, bowl, like kind of thing, like a bulbous glass encasement. It's a little similar to kind of like where he was.
It really makes you want to write a story about like a sinister Christmas ornament.
I know. How fun would that be? Oh my God. We should write a whole book of short stories that are just inspired by these little elements. Like it wouldn't actually be Azazel. We wouldn't be doing any like, intellectual property infringement. But like, can you imagine an evil Christmas tree ornament, Christmas story, like a real Christmas story with an evil Christmas tree ornament? Now I want to write that.
And there's a whole Victorian tradition, of course, of Christmas ghost stories. I also just wanted to mention that in the script, Neil talks about being a little uncertain about that twist. He said, well, I'm worried that it's a little too good versus evil. And it's also a bit like the punchline of Sandman 7. And then he says, what I think is great, what the hell, it's where the story goes and it's where we have to follow. And I think trusting the story, doing what's right for the story is, again, just good Neil advice, even though it was to himself there.
Right, but he found it though. Like he wrote his way to it. And sometimes you have to just realize that the story is going to go where the story is going to go. And as a writer, you get that feeling. It's like a puzzle piece clicking into place and you know it's right. And you may have your doubts about it, but that's where this story is going and you just kind of ride that horse out of the barn. So yeah, I really appreciate that. I love that Neil writes his way through these things in the actual script itself and just left it in there. Like just left it in there for people. I love that.
I forgot to say this, but Neil also, he'll just start the script saying things like, I'm not feeling well, or I'm recovered now. I don't have the flu anymore. And he allows himself to just be wherever he is and to start by putting words on the page. And then he left it in the same way we leave our little, weird glitches in
just
the podcast.
Leaving a little thumbprint on there. But also what I like about that and what I think and again, I know nothing about anything. I don't know Neil. I don't know anybody. I didn't work on any of this, but like it starts this as a conversation with somebody, which is a collaborative thing.
Yes.
Like it puts Neil in this script as a person who is connecting with other people who are half a world away, working on this, via fax machine or whatever it was y'all were doing there in the 90s. And so the idea that he created this script in a way that could be a collaborative conversation as much as it is a story, I like that. It shows the acknowledgement and understanding of other humans there on the receiving end working with you. And I would love, do you have these, were these published in a book or are these like copies that you had lying around from back then? Or
I used to have them. But misplaced all of them. No, Neil sent me some again because he was like, you might find this useful. But
I love it.
Yeah.
I love that insight.
I'll have to share some of them with you because I think you would like that.
Oh, God, no, I would absolutely love it. And thank you, Neil, for sending them. One of the other things that I wanted to kind of like hit on, once again, we're coming back to this place where Dream at the end of everything shows empathy. And, and plays in this really compassionate space because here we have Coranzon or Chornzon or whatever he is.
Coranzon.
There you go. Who battled, this is the dude who battled for the helm, early on, and has never been kind to Dream, is a demon. I mean, if he was kind, it'd be weird, But here we are at the end. Dream rescues him. Dream could have just rescued Nada and left Coranzon in there, but he didn't. He pulled him out, and rescued him anyway. And it's just an element and it always happens in these quiet little aside moments where Dream, like we've got this whole big thing, it's all about Nada, and then we take a moment for him to be saving Coranzon as well. Like, like letting Rachel have a nice dream, with in that issue with Constantine where he's getting the sand. And, like we always come back to this. It's such a frequent note that I find it so interesting that like one of the themes, and it's such a quiet theme that runs like a kind of like a golden thread in a tapestry and keeps repeating and coming up, is this compassion, is this empathy, is this like moment of unnecessary and often unasked for kindness that Dream just does anyway, and then moves on and doesn't want a cookie for being a great guy. We don't make a big deal out of it. And there's something about that I find to be such, in times where we are looking for a connection to humanity, and here we have this anthropomorphization of a concept, who is reconnecting us with that part of our humanity. And I think that sometimes one of the things that gets lost is that empathy, is that compassion, is that unasked for moment of consideration. And we have that with Dream all the time, like constantly.
I think you're right. And yet, as I reflect on this, sometimes I think Morpheus is doing something out of compassion. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think he is doing his duty. He has this really sharp sense of responsibility. So when he grants the Constantine's request to help Rachel, as an afterthought. It didn't occur to him. In this case, I don't mean to take away from his growth, but it's still, he promised, safety and protection to everyone. And so he's also doing his duty there by Sorensen. So
because he's under his protection, even the people that he didn't know about.
So I think for him, very often duty and responsibility come before his own emotions.
Interesting. So is it duty or is it empathy? Everybody out there, make the arguments. We'll see you on Twitter. All right. So let's move into Lucien's library, which are behind the scenes. There may be some spoilers here for anybody who is spoiler sensitive and hasn't already read the entirety of Sandman. I don't know who you are, but if you're here, welcome. We love you. And we're just giving you a warning that there might be some spoilers in this section. So what do you have for us this week, Alisa?
Well, first of all, from the scripts, it seems that Neil would, as I said, would just be writing about whatever he was doing. Often it seemed like there was something on TV in the background. I don't think, in the time I've known him, because I was with him when he was writing most, if not all, of the Norse mythology book, sometimes there would be music going, but really not a TV or anything. But in those days, there was a TV, and he said there was a Belgian vampire film called Daughters of Darkness. And it's a 1971 Belgian film. Neil calls it possibly the most perverse vampire movie ever. I watched a trailer and now I'm kind of wanting to take a look at it, although it seems pretty scary, although there's a snazzy silver sequin dress that is so 70s. It's like a cross between The Hunger and like the Sonny and Cher show, just from the trailer. I'm here for it.
I love it. That sounds awesome.
So other little things, Morpheus changes. So we see in that scene where he's rescuing Nada, first he is the Sandman we're more used to seeing, who's sort of very white. And then we see him morph into being the African Morpheus that would be seen from Nada's POV. I don't think I saw that in the script, unless I'm wrong, or maybe that was added after. But if that was Kelly Jones's initiative, then that was great collaboration. And then there's just a scene, page 20, panel 4, where there's this beautiful, soulful shot of Morpheus, and in the script it just says, "Just do this as a beautiful facial study of the character, Kelly. Maybe pull out your charcoal or washes for this one small panel. He's looking slightly down and his eyes are in darkness. He looks very thin and vulnerable, but you also realize that this is simply not someone you mess with." And I just thought that was wonderful. And then, the whole pullback. So it's just sort of nice to see that this was an invitation to the artist, to Kelly Jones in this case, to be amazing. Yeah. My last little Lucien's library is called Nidog Corpsesucker. And in the scene where Thor says, under his breath, something, he says Nidog Corpsesucker. And I just looked it up. I remembered, and I'm probably saying it wrong. Is it Nithog? It should be Nithog, maybe?
I have no idea. Somebody out there knows.
Nidog or Nithog is a dragon that is gnawing at the root of the world tree. But there's a thought that the etymology, that it might be, a really, Nith was a term for a social stigma, implying the loss of honor and the status of a villain. So anyway, Nidog Corpsesucker, I want to bring it into more common parlance, because I think we should absolutely start. We should make fetch a thing, is what I'm saying. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, Alisa. So what is your favorite page in this issue? Oh, gosh. I think Morpheus telling us that the key corrupts, and then Matthew the Raven looking out at us with a really fantastic frontal raven face and saying, well, it's a good thing it went to those angels then, as in they couldn't possibly be corrupted.
Yeah, I'm really interested to kind of see where that ends up going. I have to say, for me, it's the page where Remiel in real time is both delivering and processing God's command. And Duma just silently in the background in the upper corner of the panel. God, I love how this was done. You see him slowly lowering down, and then his feet just touch the ground, and that's it. And that's the moment where you know that, like, this is it. And his face is covered in tears. He's watching Remiel suffer. And you just get the sense that Duma is a badass. And I really love that.
And it's both literal and figurative. It's like the two things at once.
Yes, exactly. So what's your favorite part of the story?
Oh, gosh. I love Nuala wandering through the castle and half overhearing intrigues as she goes. But I have a second runner-up because when I first read Thor's awful joke, "You're Thor, I'm the Thor I could hardly pith," that was stuck in my head in the night for weeks. And of course, Nidog Corpsucker.
Yes, which is a very, very good curse. For me, I have to say, like, when Remiel, it's the same. My favorite part, my favorite page are the same thing. That twist, Remiel's so devastated. Duma's just accepting, of this fate. Remiel is struggling, and Duma still doesn't speak. Like he's made a commitment, an oath, of silence, a vow of silence, and he's not going to break it. Under any circumstances, even being condemned to running hell, and so, like, that the one person who wasn't vying for hell, who didn't want it, got it, makes so much sense. It's wonderful. It was right in front of our faces the whole time. And here it is, I think it's just beautiful.
Yeah, there are a lot of jobs where the only person who would be anywhere, near capable of doing it is the person who doesn't actively want it.
Yeah, I can think of a few where that would be really, really good.
If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, connect with the show on Twitter. Follow @Chipperish and use the hashtag EndlessPodcast. Or send your comments or questions to endless@chipperish.com.
This episode of Endless was brought to you by the Chipperish media producers who support us on Patreon at the power producer level. These people are the reason why Endless is coming to you free and ad-free right now. So thank you to Abby, Alice, Christina, Erica, Jane, Kevin, Kristen, Michael, Rose, Sarah, Shelley, and Stephania. And this week's special message for our power producers: I thank you all for coming here, and I trust that, although you may be disappointed by my decision, you will understand it.
To find out how you too can support Chipperish Media, visit patreon.com/Chipperish. Other ways to show your support? Write a great review on Apple Podcasts, tell your friends about the show, or invoke the wrath of chaos from the Shivering Brigade to the Laughing Dancers. Whatever.
This episode of Endless was edited by Chipperish content editor Jack Cram. Jack, thank you for having me at your party, Mr. Dreamy. I had a lovely time. We'll be back next time with Season of Mist Epilogue, issue number 28 of the Sandman series. Until then, reality here conforms to my wishes. It is what I wish it to be. No more, no less.